The cold wind swept across downtown Atlanta as cameras and staff gathered outside the old red brick building of Hope Haven, a shelter that had quietly served the city's homeless for nearly 3 decades. Inside, volunteers arranged trays of food and folded donated blankets, unaware that a moment about to unfold would travel far beyond those walls. When former Ambassador Nikki and Representative Jasmine Crockett arrived together that morning, even the media seemed uncertain of what to expect. They had come from opposite political worlds, yet there they were, side by side, coats buttoned against the chill, greeting volunteers with the same warm smiles. No podiums, no press statements, just 2 women walking into a place where titles didn't matter. The smell of freshly baked cornbread filled the air as Haley bent down to speak with an elderly man sitting on a cot, his hands trembling from the cold. Jasmine, a few feet away, knelt beside a young mother holding her child, offering her one of the new blankets. Their gestures weren't staged, they were instinctive. Small acts of empathy that silenced the usual noise of politics. A volunteer whispered to a local reporter, "You can feel it. They're not here to be seen. They're here to see." Later, someone captured a photo. Haley and Crocket standing side by side, hair windblown, holding serving trays in a cafeteria line, laughing with a group of children. That single image, 2 women from different sides of the aisle united by compassion, would explode across social media within hours. But for everyone in that shelter, it wasn't viral yet. It was just real. Before the cameras and the applause, there were 2 women who had lived very different lives. Yet both carried memories that led them to the same place on that cold morning. For Jasmine Crockett, compassion wasn't a political choice. It was her inheritance. Growing up in Texas, she had watched her mother teach children whose families could barely afford a meal. Some days her mother would pack 2 lunches, one for herself and one for the quiet student she knew would come to school hungry. "We help because we can," she used to tell Jasmine, "not because someone's watching." Those words stayed with her long after she left home. Years later, as a young public defender, Jasmine saw firsthand how poverty carved deep lines through people's lives. She defended clients who didn't need lectures. They needed second chances. Every time she walked into a courtroom, she thought of her mother's lunch bag and the kindness it represented. Even after becoming a congresswoman, she carried that same quiet mission, to remind the world that dignity doesn't disappear just because someone loses their home. On the other side of the story stood Nikki, a woman known for strength and diplomacy, but also for quiet reflection. Her story began in a small town in South Carolina, where her parents, immigrants with modest means, had taught her that pride and compassion could coexist. Her father often volunteered at local food drives, while her mother spent Sundays sewing quilts for families who'd lost their homes to storms. Haley had never forgotten how it felt to see kindness handed out without question, without conditions. "Charity," her father once said, "isn't about giving from abundance. It's about giving from belief." That belief followed her into adulthood. Even as she navigated global politics and national headlines, Haley made it a point to visit shelters and women's homes quietly, without photographers. She often said those visits grounded her more than any meeting ever could. So when the National Homelessness Task Force invited both women to participate in a bipartisan community outreach day, it wasn't an event. It was an opportunity. Jasmine immediately said yes. Haley, upon learning who else would attend, smiled and said, "Maybe it's time to remind people what grace looks like." The morning of the visit, the 2 women met briefly outside the shelter's entrance. The moment was unexpectedly warm. "Good to see you, Congresswoman," Haley greeted, extending her hand. "Please, call me Jasmine," she replied, her tone easy, genuine. That small exchange set the tone for the rest of the day. Inside, the shelter's director led them through the halls, past rows of donated coats, a play area filled with worn toys, and a kitchen alive with volunteers. Both women moved with a kind of natural empathy, greeting residents not as officials, but as fellow humans. Haley asked a teenage boy about his favorite subject in school. Math, he said shyly. She laughed and told him, "Then you're already smarter than me." The boy grinned. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat with a young woman holding a newborn. "He's beautiful," she whispered, gently touching the child's blanket. The mother smiled nervously and said, "We came here 2 weeks ago. They saved us." Jasmine's eyes softened. "And you're saving him," she said quietly. The two women crossed paths again in the dining hall. Without a word, they began serving lunch side by side, Haley handing out plates, Jasmine pouring water. The cameras clicked, but neither seemed to notice. They shared small smiles, brief glances of mutual respect, not because they agreed on everything, but because they understood what this moment meant. Later, as the crowd thinned and the noise settled into the low hum of gratitude, Haley turned to Jasmine and said, "Sometimes the loudest way to lead is to simply show up." Jasmine nodded. "And to listen," she added. That exchange, brief, authentic, unplanned, would be quoted in dozens of articles the following day. But inside that shelter, it wasn't history being written. It was humanity being remembered. When they finally stepped outside, the air was sharp but clean. Reporters called out questions neither woman answered. They didn't need to. The look they shared said enough. Two public servants, two different journeys, one shared understanding. In a time when division filled headlines, they had quietly proven something rare. Compassion doesn't need a party. It just needs presence. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the shelter's dusty windows, casting long golden streaks across the cafeteria floor. Lunch service was over, and the volunteers had begun cleaning up. A few children played near a stack of worn-out toys, their laughter echoing softly through the halls. The air carried that unmistakable scent of stew and fresh cornbread, comforting, familiar, humble. Nikki Haley stood near the serving line, tying her hair back with a loose band. She had spent the last hour handing out meals, laughing with residents, and thanking the volunteers who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Her voice had grown slightly hoarse, but her energy didn't waver. "You all make this feel like home," she told one of the elderly cooks, who blushed at the compliment. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside a group of young children, helping them draw on sheets of donated printer paper. A little girl, no more than 5, tugged at her sleeve. "Can you draw my mama?" she asked. Jasmine smiled, her heart tightening. "I'll try," she said softly, sketching a simple outline while the child giggled. Cash Patel's moment of standing had been one of silent respect. But this was something else entirely. This was empathy alive in motion. A volunteer coordinator gently tapped a microphone near the front of the hall. "Before we finish for the day," she said, "we'd like to say a few words of thanks to our visitors, not for their positions, but for their presence." She gestured toward Jasmine and Nikki, inviting them to the stage. Jasmine stood first, brushing her hands against her jeans. Haley joined her, still holding her apron, her palms slightly dusted with flour. The audience, a mix of residents, staff, and reporters, quieted as they stood side by side under the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Haley took a breath and began, her voice calm but sincere. "When I walked in here this morning, I thought I was coming to help," she said. "But the truth is, I've been the one helped today." She paused, letting her gaze travel across the room, to the faces lined with hardship but filled with resilience. Sometimes, when you spend years in politics, you forget how simple goodness really is. It's in a shared meal, a kind word, a place where no one's left outside. Jasmine nodded slightly as Haley stepped back. The microphone passed to her. "You know," Jasmine began, "when I was a kid, my mom used to bring home leftovers from school lunch trays to feed our neighbors who didn't have enough. I didn't understand it back then. I'd ask her, 'Mama, don't they have their own food?' And she'd say, 'They will, when the world remembers them.'" Her eyes shone under the light. Today, I saw the world remember. There was no applause yet, just silence. The kind that happens when people feel something too deep to interrupt. Then, from the back of the hall, a frail voice spoke up. It belonged to an older man named Leonard, a former teacher who had been living at the shelter for 3 years. "Ma'am," he called out, "thank you for coming. It's good to know we're not invisible." Jasmine looked at him tenderly. "No one in this room is invisible," she said, stepping down from the small platform and walking toward him. She knelt beside his chair, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're part of the story. You're proof that compassion isn't lost, just waiting to be found again." The audience felt it, that electric warmth that travels through a crowd when truth touches heart. Haley joined her, kneeling on the other side. Leonard looked between them, tears glistening on his cheeks. "No cameras, no politics," he whispered. "Just people." And that was when the room began to applaud. Not the polite applause of ceremony, but the full, rising sound of gratitude. The volunteers, the residents, the staff, even the reporters lowered their cameras and clapped with open hands. Someone captured that moment anyway. 2 leaders kneeling beside a man who had once felt forgotten, surrounded by people who had nothing but shared everything. That photograph, that unplanned, unguarded second of grace, became the image the world couldn't stop talking about. It flooded timelines and evening broadcasts with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like," and "When compassion leads, division fades." But inside that shelter, before the world ever saw it, there was only stillness. Haley and Crocket stayed there for a while longer, talking to Leonard about his days as a teacher, about the students who still wrote him letters. "I used to tell them," he said, "kindness isn't a lesson, it's a practice." Haley smiled softly. "Then you're still teaching, sir?" As they stood to leave, Jasmine turned to the crowd once more. "We all have different roles in this world," she said, "but we share one responsibility, to care, because the measure of a nation isn't its wealth, it's how it treats those with the least." The applause grew again, rolling through the hall like thunder cushioned by love. Outside, the setting sun painted the city in amber light. When they finally stepped out of the building, a group of children ran to the door waving goodbye. Haley waved back, laughing. Jasmine reached into her bag and handed the little girl from earlier her drawing, a mother holding a child, surrounded by a bright yellow heart. Hours later, that same drawing would appear in the viral photo, crumpled slightly but visible in Jasmine's hand, as if symbolizing everything the moment had meant: warmth, connection, and hope. And in that simple act of giving, not speeches, not signatures, but presence, they reminded the world that politics might divide rooms, but compassion always fills them. By sunrise the next morning, America had already seen the photo. It was everywhere, across social media feeds, on the front pages of news sites, and displayed on television screens from New York to Los Angeles. The image of Nikki Haley and Jasmine Crocket kneeling beside an elderly man at a homeless shelter, their hands gently resting on his shoulders, radiated something the world hadn't felt from politics in a long time: sincerity. The caption beneath most versions of the viral post was simple: "This is leadership." News anchors replayed the clip of the 2 women's visit, contrasting it against the usual noise of debates and divisions. One commentator said on air, "For a moment, politics paused, and humanity took the microphone." Another wrote, "When 2 women from different worlds find common ground in compassion, the rest of us have no excuse to forget ours." Within hours, hashtags like #TheCompassionMoment, #Haley and Crocket, and #Humanity first began trending worldwide. Teachers showed the photo in classrooms. Churches mentioned it in sermons. Even late-night hosts, often cynical about politics, spoke of the scene with genuine warmth. But what most people didn't know was that the story behind the photo didn't end when the cameras left. That same morning, as light filtered through her blinds, Jasmine Crocket sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold. Her phone was flooded, messages from reporters, colleagues, and people she'd never met. One text stood out, from a young volunteer at the shelter. It read, "The man you spoke to yesterday, Leonard, He hasn't stopped smiling since you left. He said he finally felt seen again." She put the phone down, her eyes misting. The world was celebrating the picture, but for her, it wasn't about virality. It was about Leonard, and the hundreds like him who didn't need speeches, just to be remembered. Across town, Nikki Haley was having a similar morning. Her husband had placed a folded newspaper beside her breakfast plate. The headline read, "Haley and Crockett's kindness crosses party lines. America applauds." She smiled, shaking her head slightly. "I didn't do anything special," she said quietly. Her husband looked at her and replied, "That's why it mattered." The nation's response was unlike anything in recent years. Online, people began sharing their own compassion moments. Police officers posted photos of delivering meals to the homeless. Students organized clothing drives. Local shelters saw a sudden influx of volunteers. The Hope Haven shelter, the one where the moment happened, received more donations in a single week than in the entire previous year. When a reporter asked the shelter's director what she thought of the attention, she said simply, "The world saw kindness and wanted to join it." Later that week, both Jasmine and Nikki were invited to appear together on a national morning show. It was their first joint interview since the visit. The studio lights gleamed as they sat side by side. No scripts, no talking points, just two women reflecting. The host leaned forward. "When you look back at that day," she asked, "did you know it would become such a moment?" Haley smiled, glancing at Jasmine. "Not at all. We didn't plan it. We just showed up." Jasmine added, "And maybe that's why it worked. People don't want rehearsed compassion. They want real connection." The audience in the studio applauded softly, sensing the weight of those words. The host then showed the viral photograph on a large screen behind them. The room fell quiet again. "Do you know what people are calling this?" the host asked. Jasmine raised an eyebrow playfully. "Hopefully not a miracle," she joked. The host smiled. "They're calling it the moment America remembered its heart." Both women sat still for a second, visibly moved. Haley broke the silence. If it made even one person look at someone differently, someone they might have ignored yesterday, then it was worth it. Outside the studio, the world continued to buzz. Editorials praised the event as a rare bridge across America's political divide. One newspaper headline read, "Two women changed the tone, not with words, but with grace." But perhaps the most meaningful impact came not from politicians or pundits, but from ordinary people. At a small elementary school in Indiana, a teacher named Ms. Caldwell showed her students the photograph and asked, "What do you see here?" One boy raised his hand and said, "They're helping someone." A girl added, "They're not fighting." Another whispered, "They look like friends." Ms. Caldwell smiled and said, "That's right, and that's what kindness looks like." Meanwhile, back at Hope Haven, Leonard, the elderly man from the photo, became something of a local hero. Journalists visited him, but he always said the same thing. "They didn't save me. They reminded me I still matter." When asked how he felt seeing his image all over the internet, he chuckled. "I don't know much about the internet," he said, "but if it makes people kinder, then it's good enough for me." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Jasmine Crocket and Nikki Haley spoke briefly over the phone. There was no agenda, no cameras, just two women reflecting on a simple act that had resonated with millions. "Funny how one afternoon can change so much," Jasmine said softly. Haley replied, "Maybe it didn't change anything. Maybe it just reminded us what was always there." They both laughed quietly. There was no need for grand words, just the shared peace of knowing that for once, politics had taken a back seat to compassion. And somewhere, on 1,000 screens, the image of that day continued to circulate. Two women, one man, and a room full of kindness, reminding the world that empathy is never out of style. Months passed, but the echo of that day at Hope Haven never faded. What began as a simple act of kindness, two women kneeling beside a man who had been forgotten, grew into a symbol of grace that neither politics nor time could dilute. Across the country, The Compasion moment, as the media called it, had become more than a headline. It had become a reminder, a quiet invitation to rediscover humanity. The first ripple began in schools. Teachers, inspired by the photograph of Nikki Haley and Jasmine Crockett, started hosting kindness days. Students would spend a morning writing letters to the elderly, donating old toys, or visiting local shelters. Many schools even displayed the image of that moment with the caption, "Leadership begins with empathy." One high school principal in Michigan described it best during an assembly. They didn't pass a bill, they didn't hold a press conference, they just cared, and the world noticed. In Washington, both women continued their own work, but something in their approach had changed. Their staff noticed it first. Jasmine's meetings were quieter, more collaborative. Nikki's briefings carried a new warmth. They didn't always agree on policy, but they had found common ground in purpose. And that was enough. A few months later, the two were invited back to Hope Haven for a follow-up visit. The shelter had been renovated with the influx of donations. Fresh paint on the walls, new cots, a small library corner for children. When they arrived, the air buzzed with anticipation. Residents and volunteers lined the halls, clapping softly as they entered. Leonard, the retired teacher who had been part of the viral photo, was waiting near the entrance. His hair was whiter now, but his eyes sparkled the same way they had that afternoon. "Ladies," he said warmly, "you didn't just help this place. You helped the world see us." Jasmine hugged him gently. "No, Leonard," she said, "you helped the world see itself." As they toured the renovated shelter, a small group of children followed them, curious, excited. Nikki stopped near the new kitchen area and knelt beside a little boy who clutched a toy truck. "What's your name?" she asked. "Aaron," he said shyly. "My mom works here now." Nikki smiled. "Then she's one of the heroes," she said, handing him a cookie from the tray. Nearby, Jasmine noticed a young volunteer wearing a t-shirt that read, "Kindness is louder than politics." She laughed softly. "That's the slogan of the year," she told the girl, who blushed and replied, "It's because of you two." That evening, the shelter hosted a small ceremony to unveil a new plaque near the entrance. It read, "In gratitude to all who remember that compassion is not weakness, it's strength." Inspired by the visit of Representative Jasmine Crockett and Ambassador Nikki Haley. The room filled with applause, but neither woman spoke right away. Instead, they shared a quiet glance, the kind that doesn't need words because it's built on understanding. Finally, Nikki took the microphone. "This isn't about us," she said. "It's about what happens when we choose to care without asking who deserves it." She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Teachers, volunteers, veterans, mothers, children. "Because everyone deserves to be seen." Jasmine followed, her voice soft but firm. "When we left this place months ago, we thought it was just one afternoon, but now I realize it was the beginning of something bigger. Every letter, every donation, every act of kindness that came after, that's your story, not ours." The audience rose to their feet in quiet applause. In the back of the room, Leonard wiped his eyes. A few volunteers joined hands. The hum of emotion was gentle, unforced, real. Outside, the evening sky turned gold and lavender as the city lights flickered to life. The two women stood side by side near the steps, watching people trickle out with smiles and tears. Jasmine looked at Nikki and said, "You know, when I was younger, I thought leadership was about how loud you could be, but maybe it's about how deeply you can listen." Nikki nodded. "And how sincerely you can serve." A light breeze rustled the banners hanging above them. "Hope lives here." A photographer standing quietly at the curb snapped one last candid shot. The two women gazing up at the shelter side by side, framed by dusk and soft light. That image, unplanned, unposed, would later appear on magazine covers with the headline, "Grace Endures." In the months that followed, both women continued their paths, separate but connected. Jasmine launched a bipartisan Humanity First initiative to fund community projects across underserved neighborhoods. Nikki partnered with private donors to expand shelters nationwide, calling it the One Table program, built on the belief that every person deserves a seat and a meal. When asked in an interview what kept them motivated, Jasmine said simply, "That day taught me something powerful. Hope is contagious when shared." Nikki added, "Kindness isn't political, it's practical." Years later, students would still write essays about that photograph, the one that showed two leaders who didn't just talk about compassion, but lived it. And at Hope Haven, the framed image still hung on the wall near the entrance, where Leonard, now a volunteer himself, greeted visitors with the same words every time: "Welcome home." Because that's what compassion does. It brings people home to themselves. And though the world would move on to new headlines, the message of that day never dimmed. It whispered softly through classrooms, boardrooms, and homes, a gentle reminder that the smallest act of care can heal the largest divide. When kindness becomes contagious, even power begins to listen. And on that quiet truth, the story of two women, one Republican, one Democrat, both human, found its lasting legacy.